President Trump claims he is close to a mineral deal with Ukraine that will net the U.S. hundreds of billions of dollars. But is there literally no mineral deal where the U.S. comes out on top? Just why is the very concept of stuff for aid such a disaster for the United States? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. We're going to talk about this, plus we're going to talk about some of the changes to the battlefield and, of course, the difference between what Trump says and what his negotiators are saying. Let's get into it. Okay, so I wanted to just take this quick 27-second clip from Trump himself because I think it's important to hear from his own mouth what he says about this mineral deal.
So we're going to sign a deal to get security because we have to do that. We're spending our treasure. They're spending their blood. They are. And they're very brave in every way you can imagine. But we are spending our treasure on a country that's very, very far away. We're signing an agreement, hopefully in the next fairly short period of time, that will assure us that we'll get $400 or $500 billion back.
Okay, so this is the thing. So Trump maintains
this video is brought
mineral
to you
deal
by
is going to net him hundreds of billions of dollars. And certainly from what we've seen in the first draft of the deal, that actually appears like it could be something close to the case. Now, there's a bunch of weird problems that the president doesn't quite seem to have hammered out and that nobody really knows until we see the deal itself. One is this difference between foreign direct investment, right, which is where U.S. companies will partner and go into another country and partner with them to extract minerals, build a factory, etc. This is something that's not only common, but countries seek it. The ability to, again, Poland is my favorite example of an Eastern European country that 20 years ago had very little foreign direct investment. But as a result of U.S. and European companies chasing a business-friendly Polish environment, a very competitive workforce, they performed a lot of direct investment, building factories, building out companies in Poland. And as a result, everybody won. The Polish economy won. The United States companies won because they were able to produce goods and services far cheaper in Poland and then sell them in both the EU and the United States, right? And the U.S. government won because they had significant increases in tax revenue as those businesses became more profitable. So there is a scenario in which it looks like everyone can win from a mineral deal. But the problem is Trump may be talking about we being the U.S. government, and that is where things get a lot more fraught. Because if you have a deal in which the U.S. government enters a country and begins to extract its value or receive some kind of kickback, what you end up with is money that should be going to develop that country is instead extracted and actually impedes development, right? The Ukraine's rare earth minerals and other natural resources are going to be essential to rebuilding the country. And ultimately, the problem is that when you have a country, there is only so much. There's some things that you can do like charitably, right? You can repave roads or help clear mines, that sort of thing. But ultimately, you need foreign direct investment to make an economy grow. And you cannot grow an economy when the value it produces gets scooped out. This is actually one of the key differences you notice that, if you looked back to the 1500s, right, you had the United States and you had South America as both colonies of European empires, but only one of them became a world superpower in its own right, the United States, right, and achieved a high level of independence in the 1770s. The reason is because Spain practiced the first form, right? The Spanish crown went to these areas. They didn't care about governance. They didn't care about development. They didn't even care about settling it. They only put enough of a footprint there to extract the minerals, oftentimes using the forced labor of the indigenous populations. And as a result, none of that value that those populations produced ever really stayed in Spain in any meaningful way, right? With the exception of building a few churches and military fortifications, that was it. In contrast, right, the United States had a trade and development type of situation, right? There was less sort of scoop and extract. It was a lot more seen as a military and like settlement venture. And so as a result, the United States ended up having more investment occur. So they had their own governance, they had their own ports, they had trade and a lot more robust infrastructure. And over time, that difference made a massive change in the United States in terms of it developed to a superior degree to to Spanish colonies. The fear is that the U.S. has pursued that same sort of strategy with a lot of its allies, particularly since the Second World War. That's why we invested in the Marshall Plan, right? We wanted to be able to sell our goods and services to the Europeans, and by selling it to them, you have to think that the Europeans said, wow, we can buy this steel, but they didn't just buy it to rebuild their homes. They bought it to rebuild factories that then produced goods and services that the United States could then purchase to raise its quality of living. Everybody won in the Marshall Plan type scenario. And the fear is that what if you had a World War I type scenario, where instead of saying, let's build up these destroyed countries, let's tear them down. Let's extract as much value as we can from them. And that short-term thinking ended up creating the hyperinflation of Germany in the 1920s. It ended up just creating a scenario in which a country that was already destroyed became even further crushed. That is sort of the dichotomy that you have when you talk about this mineral deal with Ukraine. But none of that is the actual reason I have concerns about any kind of deal. Even if the mineral deal is structured perfectly, as long as it follows what the president just said, which is we spent our money and now we have to bill for it. The problem is that the U.S. doesn't just spend its defense expenditure in Ukraine. It has a comparable relationship. This is a map of every place in the globe where the U.S. military has bases. And this is the key problem because, right, it's not, you notice we don't actually have a base in Ukraine for obvious reasons. However, the fundamental problem, actually, it says we do have a base in Ukraine. Interesting. The fundamental problem is that, I wonder when this is dated. This is probably from at least 4 or 5 years ago, but it's basically accurate. I think a couple of these Central African countries have booted us out since they had military juntas take over. But here's the takeaway. So Ukraine receives what it's told is security assistance, which is charity, right? It is going to the food bank and getting a box of cereal so you can feed your kids and resolve an emergency situation, right? And a better analogy would be that Ukraine's house is literally on fire and the United States says, we have the best hoses in the world. Take our hoses. Don't worry about it. Take the hoses, spray what you got to do, keep that fire contained. Ukraine says, dude, thank you so much. US says, don't worry about it. It's aid. It's charity, right? Calls it Ukraine aid bill, right? No doubt about it. Now imagine 2 years later, right? You're still trying to put out your house fire and your neighbor sends you a bill. And you say, wait. You can't do this for a couple of reasons. One, you said it was aid, and apparently it's not. Two, if you were going to bill me, you had to tell me the price beforehand, right? This isn't the U.S. health insurance system, okay? You have to tell me the price of the good and service that's being rendered, right? And the problem is, once you have that, the next time, right, a neighbor in your neighborhood's house catches on fire, and you're going to show up with that nice new hose, what's that neighbor going to say? They're going to say, I don't care. Get that hose away from me because I know that if I so much as look at you, you're going to think you're entitled to bill me and you won't even tell me how much it's worth. What does that mean then? Well, imagine, for example, that you are South Korea. The U.S. has provided security assistance to South Korea to a tremendous degree, not for 3 years like we did in Ukraine, but for half a century. Since the late 1950s, we have been providing security assistance to South Korea, right? The U.S. presence and cooperation with the South Koreans is the reason that South Korea is one of the most powerful, dominant economies in all of Asia. The problem is, if you are the South Korean government, you are seeing this deal, and I promise you, some people, some office in the South Korean government is saying, what do we do if the U.S. decides they are going to send us a bill, right? And the answer the South Koreans are probably going to come to is, well, we may be best off just kicking the Americans out. But here's the other problem. Is that the South Koreans, they don't host American troops because They love getting those, they love having a PX with those tax-free discounts, right? They don't love getting off-brand American jean jackets in U.S. military bases. They do it because of the North Koreans, okay? The North Koreans have an official state policy that says we are going to obliterate the South and we are going to forcibly reunify the country. And they are a nuclear power. And so the South Koreans, right, the North Koreans may look at a scenario in which the U.S. starts either sending bills or refusing further security assistance unless they get some sort of paycheck, or the South Koreans preemptively kick us out, and they're going to say, this is my best chance. Because for this one moment where the Americans no longer support the South Koreans, North Korea has nukes, its ally China has nukes, and South Korea is on its own. This is a massive, massive risk. But you can multiply this, right? Japan has the same fundamental relationship, right? It is in a territorial dispute with China over the Spratlys. And this is something where, again, China has nuclear weapons. Japan does not. Japan has been hosting American troops since the 1940s. And if they believe that they are going to be billed by the U.S., again, imagine if Trump thinks $500 billion is a fair price for 3 years of security assistance, what do you think he's going to believe is a fair price for nearly a century of security assistance, right? Japan may have no choice but to kick out the United States and refuse to accept any U.S. coercion. But what would that mean? Well, what would stop China from annexing the Spratlys and saying, if you have a problem with this, well, Japan, we have nuclear weapons, so you're going to have to just take it. And you know what? China will be right. Right? You have the same thing in Australia. You have the same thing with all these Middle Eastern countries, right? Jordan, for example, hosts U.S. troops, has had a long relationship with U.S. forces. Imagine a scenario in which Jordan and its rivals, the much larger countries like Iran, how are they going to feel when they lose or they believe that the U.S. is about to send them a bill? So the potential for instability in the globe is massive. Once you set a precedent that says that the U.S. operates on the U.S. healthcare system billing protocol, which is to say, we provide you the emergency services you desperately need, and you will find out later what it cost you, right? You believe it or not, that is not how a free market works. That is fucked up when it happens to Americans, and it's really fucked up when it happens to the other countries and the United States. And again, the loser here is going to be the United States, because when push comes to shove and you turn around and you look at some of the most productive developed economies in the world, they are going to have to sign. They have two options. One is be conquered by their enemies, either literally or economically. They're going to have to sign protection agreements with other countries that aren't the United States. Those protection agreements are definitely, if you're Russia, if you're China, if you're another major nuclear power, right, there's going to be a wink that says, yeah, this is a protection agreement, but we also expect you to trade with us and not with our rivals, the United States. And so what's going to happen is no matter how much the U.S. gets from Ukraine, it's never going to offset the power of having these powerful, the largest economies in the world stand shoulder to shoulder with you and have military and economic ties, right? You can't think of them as being discrete things where, well, we have this strong economic relationship or this strong military relationship, but our economic relationship is non-existent. Simply not the case. Look at Saudi Arabia, right? Lots of military cooperation, and a function of that is it's inexorably linked to Saudi Arabia's a commitment to supporting U.S. oil policy. So the potential for disaster is just absolutely massive. Now, here's what I want to point out is that the U.S., right, when you have someone, there are some professionals in the room, right? Trump says some stuff, and you may notice that it's basically like he's constantly doing 180s. It's almost impossible to discern what he's really thinking or feeling. But you have someone like Marco Rubio, right? This is a career politician who is a professional who understands why things happen the way they do. And when you notice that when he, or even Keith Kellogg, who I have serious disagreements with about his policies around what he sees as a valid framework for a Ukraine peace deal, these are rational actors. These are people who understand that the network and web of U.S. alliances and the need to check these autocratic dictators, when they meet with Ukrainian officials, the tone is so different, right? Polish foreign minister meets with the Secretary of State, and again, he walks away saying it was a powerful conversation between close allies. This is really important. And what this says, I think, is that Marco Rubio understands that he needs to go into damage control, right? This is somebody who's out here shoring up U.S. alliances, right? Their meeting was, quote, substantial and cordial, and it confirmed the durability of the Polish-American alliance. So you could see literally, and just Keith Kellogg had the same thing. He met with the Ukrainians and he sat there and said, hey, the Ukrainians emerged and said, this was a really productive conversation. It was really good of us to be able to have this. Totally different, totally radically different tone than what you got from the president or even from J.D. Vance's pretty combative speech. So the takeaway, I think, is that you almost have this like increasing bifurcation of the administration between people who will do exactly what Trump says and the people who understand that you literally can't do exactly what Trump says because there's so much whiplash, you cannot operate that way. And I think you're starting to see almost like a stabilization, right? The same thing that happened in the first Trump administration. You had inexperienced people come in. They signed a bunch of executive orders. They tried to do a bunch of stuff really quickly, but then slowly the system said, okay, let's think this thing through. Let's think about all the implications of what it means to do this, right? And you're starting to see that happen as the system kind of mobilizes and says, okay, there's more than just, in the United States of America, we don't elect a king, we elect a president. And the president is not the be-all, end-all. He is not the final decider of all things in this country. He is subject to the states who have their own power. He is subject to Congress that has its own authority. He is subject to the judicial branch, right? That is not a flaw in the system. It is a feature. And those other branches, I think you're slowly starting to see them roll out their ability to create consensus and say, listen, let's think through doing this sort of extraction policy for our alliances. Let's think through cutting all the IRS agents to balance the budget, right? Like let's think through these problems. And you're seeing it, right? You're seeing somebody tell Trump, again, you heard something way different. You heard Trump acknowledge that the Ukrainians are paying in blood, and while we're paying in treasure, Trump also pivots and said, listen, I'll admit Russia is the one who attacked Ukraine, even though it totally never should have started. Again, it pivots to something that is we can't disagree with. We say, yeah, I'd love to live in a world where Russia never invaded Ukraine. Yeah, that would be dope. But we don't live in that world, right? We live in a world where Russia invaded Ukraine. Sure. I'll give him a pass on that. But you could see how the president is just so prone to just flying off the handle, saying crazy shit, that it's really hard. You feel for the people that try every day to try to like turn his priorities, to the extent he has fixed priorities, turn them into actionable policy. All right. It's one of the reasons why you got to have policy people, a whole bunch of very smart, very well-read experts who can put this stuff into context. Now, I want to point out one other little detail is that lately, over the last couple of days, you've seen actually, I think, Russian efforts to advance in Ukraine slow down somewhat, right? The only things you've seen is, again, some of this, the only substantive gains you've seen is something where the Ukrainians, I think it's less about the Russians and more about the Ukrainians withdrawing from this Dachne, which they should have done a while ago. But, right, you could see they're likely trying to end the salient, shore up this area here. But you could see that over the last several days, we're working backwards through time, is that, well, Russian advances, they are occurring, and they're occurring in very low value areas. Again, this is literally like a swamp. So it's very telling, I think, that you have this incredibly this diminishing Russian advancement. And while there are some rumors that Russian recruitment has picked back up, I think actually it's a lot of Russians who are trying to get these sign-on bonuses on the belief that there will be some sort of peace deal signed before they actually end up in the front lines. And I don't think that is likely. Again, because ultimately, even if the U.S. was to walk out of a room and say, guys, we signed an agreement where we have signed peace with Russia, the Ukrainians can and probably will be like, well, that's great, America, but you were never at war with Russia. We're at war with Russia, and we decide what our peace deal looks like. And the Europeans may say, yeah, we've got your back. We're going to keep this going. Highly possible. Highly, highly possible. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Hit that subscribe button. Thanks to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergei Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorsuch, Daniel M., Ida Skycall. All of our Lieutenant tier members couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.